Good evening, everybody. Glad to have you here with me on this beautiful stormy Wednesday evening. We have storms blowing through right now. Thunderstorms, thunder, lightning, rain, the whole 9 yards, which is pretty nice for this sort of story time. Hello, T Flipper X. Hello, Obsidian Phoenix. Got something special planned tonight. Hope you like it. For everyone else, welcome to Stygian Articles, presented by the Lovecraft Tapes podcast. I am Jeremy, keeper of arcane lore, and tonight I'm going to read some horror fiction for you. Listener discretion is advised. The scary stories I read and write will sometimes contain extreme horror, violence, language, and other adult themes. Watch and listen at your own risk. And I'll just let you know there's none of that nonsense going on tonight, unfortunately, or fortunately. Depends on what you prefer. But these are relatively tame, so we'll get right to it with our first tale. As I drink some oolong tea. This is The Oval Portrait by Edgar Allan Poe. The chateau into which my valet had ventured to make forcible entrance, rather than permit me, in my desperately wounded condition, to pass a night in the open air, was one of those piles of commingled gloom and grandeur which have so long frowned among the Apennines, not less in fact than in the fancy of Mrs. Radcliffe. To all appearance, it had been temporarily and very lately abandoned. We established ourselves in one of the smallest and least sumptuously furnished apartments. It lay in a remote turret of the building. Its decorations were rich, yet tattered and antique. Its walls were hung with tapestry and bedecked with manifold and multiform armorial trophies, together with an unusually great number of very spirited modern paintings in frames of rich golden arabesque. In these paintings, which depended from the walls not only in their main surfaces, but in the very nooks which the bizarre architecture of the chateau rendered necessary. In these paintings, my incipient delirium, perhaps, had caused me to take deep interest, so that I bade Pedro to close the heavy shutters of the room, since it was already night, to light the tongues of a tall candelabrum which stood by the head of my bed, and to throw open far and wide the fringed curtains of black velvet which enveloped the bed itself. I wished all this done that I might resign myself, if not to sleep, at least alternately to the contemplation of these pictures, and the perusal of a small volume which had been found upon the pillow, and which purported to criticize and describe them. Long, long I read, and devotedly I gazed. Rapidly and gloriously the hours flew by, and the deep midnight came. The position of the candelabrum displeased me, and outreaching my hand with difficulty, rather than disturb my slumbering valet, I placed it so as to throw its rays more fully upon the book. But the action produced an effect altogether unanticipated. The rays of the numerous candles, for there were many, now fell within a niche of the room which had hitherto been thrown into deep shade by one of the bedposts. I thus saw in vivid light a picture all unnoticed before. It was the portrait of a young girl, just ripening into womanhood. I glanced at the painting hurriedly and then closed my eyes. Why I did this was not at first apparent even to my own perception, But while my lids remained thus shut, I ran over in my mind my reason for so shutting them. It was an impulsive movement to gain time for thought, to make sure that my vision had not deceived me, to calm and subdue my fancy for a more sober and more certain gaze. In a very few moments, I again looked fixedly at the painting. Now, now, sorry. That I now saw aright, I could not and would not doubt. For the first flashing of the candles upon that canvas had seemed to dissipate the dreamy stupor which was stealing over my senses, and to startle me at once into waking life. The portrait, I have already said, was that of a young girl. It was a mere head and shoulders, done in what is technically termed a vignette manner, much in the style of the favorite heads of Sully. The arms, the bosom, and even the ends of the radiant hair melted imperceptibly into the vague yet deep shadow which formed the background of the whole. The frame was oval, richly gilded, and filigreed in Moresque. As a thing of art, nothing could be more admirable than the painting itself. But it could have been neither the execution of the work nor the immortal beauty of the countenance which had so suddenly and so vehemently moved me. Least of all could it have been that my fancy, shaken from its half slumber, had mistaken the head for that of a living person. I saw at once that the peculiarities of the design, of the vignetting, and of the frame must have instantly dispelled such idea, must have prevented even its momentary entertainment. Thinking earnestly upon these points, I remained for an hour perhaps, half sitting, half reclining, with my vision riveted upon the portrait. At length, satisfied with the true secret of its effect, I fell back within the bed. I had found the spell of the picture in an absolute life-likeness of expression, which, at first startling, finally confounded, subdued, and appalled me. With deep and reverent awe, I replaced the candelabrum in its former position. The cause of my deep agitation being thus shut from view, I sought eagerly the volume which discussed the paintings and their histories. Turning to the number which designated the oval portrait, I there read the vague and quaint words which follow. She was a maiden of rarest beauty, and not more lovely than full of glee. And evil was the hour when she saw and loved and wedded the painter. He, passionate, studious, austere, and having already a bride in his art, she, a maiden of rarest beauty, and not more lovely than full of glee, all light and smiles, and frolicsome as the young fawn, loving and cherishing all things, hating only the art which was her rival, dreading only the palette and the brushes and other untoward instruments which deprived her of the countenance of her lover. It was thus a terrible thing for this lady to hear the painter speak of his desire to portray even his young bride. But she was humble and obedient, and sat meekly for many weeks in the dark, high turret chamber, where the light dripped upon the pale canvas only from overhead. But he, the painter, took glory in his work, which went on from hour to hour and from day to day. And he was passionate and wild, a moody man, who became lost in reveries, so that he would not see the light which fell so ghastly in that lone turret withered the health and the spirits of his bride, who pined visibly to all but him. Yet she smiled on and still on, uncomplainingly, because she saw that the painter, who had high renown, took a fervid and burning pleasure in his task, and wrought day and night to depict her who so loved him, yet who grew daily more fervid and burning pleasure in his task. Oh, sorry. Who grew daily more dispirited and weak. And in sooth, some who beheld the portrait spoke of its resemblance in low words, as of a mighty marvel, and a proof not less of the power of the painter than of his deep love for her whom he depicted so surpassingly well. But at length, as the labor drew nearer its conclusion, there were admitted none into the turret, for the painter had grown wild with the ardor of his work, and turned his eyes from canvas merely, even to regard the countenance of his wife. And he would not see that the tints which he spread upon the canvas were drawn from the cheeks of her who sat beside him. And when many weeks had passed, and but little remained to do, save one brush upon the mouth and one tint upon the eye, the spirit of the lady again flickered up as the flame within the socket of the lamp. And then the brush was given, and then the tint was placed. And for a moment, the painter stood entranced before the work which he had wrought. But in the next, while he yet gazed, he grew tremulous and very pallid and aghast, and crying with a loud voice, "This is indeed life itself!" turned suddenly to regard his beloved. She was dead. That was The Oval Portrait by Edgar Allan Poe. I'm sure I've read that before, but I'm quite sure it's been a long time as well. I chose it because it was super short, and his turns of phrase can be a bit challenging. Um, but also, I just liked the sort of seed of that uh, surprise shock ending, which is a signature of many people, many authors beyond him. And of course, you can see a little bit of Lovecraft in there. I'm sure Lovecraft took some pieces of that particular story to inform the structure of his own. I actually think it's quite a bit like The Outsider in many ways. So yeah, it's an interesting tale. It's written in a very tight narrative. It doesn't really go into too much detail. Hey, Brindle, welcome. Glad you enjoyed that. I tried my best. I stumbled here and there. I'll blame the storms outside. All right. The second tale I have lined up for you is a little bit longer, but it was written by me just this past week. This is called A Country Road in Vermont. Nothing clears one's mind or spirit more than a good long walk. The fresh air billowing in your lungs, cool oxygen easing your brain, and the soothing natural orchestra of chirping insects, sing-songing birds, and the occasional, if you're lucky, baritone throbbings from the throat of a lonesome frog on the shores of one of our many rural Vermont freshwater ponds. Jess, my mother once asked, over a breakfast of buckwheat pancakes slathered in pats of melted butter and smothered in sweet maple syrup produced by our own trees. Where do you go on those lengthy patrols? I just smiled because I really couldn't say. You see, when I walked, sometimes for hours, I lost all sense of time and place. My wits squirreled in on themselves, working unconsciously on life's myriad problems, untying mental knots until I eventually, somehow, made it safely back home. During that sometimes lengthy perambulation, I had sussed out a particularly tricky situation without even being aware of it. The answer, for whatever question might have been plaguing me, seemed to have been delivered from on high. It was the closest feeling to the divine I'd ever achieved to that point in my life, despite having gone to church since an early age. It was on one of these strolls in late summer I found my wanderings had taken me to a peculiar looking covered bridge that I had never noticed before. Of course, these provincial roads were practically teeming with such structures, a necessity to traverse over the many streams and rivers hereabouts. But this particular trestle was wholly unfamiliar to me. Curious, I moved in to take a closer look. At once, I was much intrigued, for the building itself was composed of some strange alloy, a metallic barn like covering, quite different than the usual warped wood, leaning shanties that had to be repainted every 10 years or so. And instead of the expected railroad tie flooring beneath, the surface appeared to be a single slab of smooth, beaten iron. Through and to the other side, only 50 yards away, I could see the sun dappled opposite shore where the road continued northward. I peered more intently at the entrance to this odd, out of place overpass, but could not see any markings to indicate which township might be ahead. At this stage, I could have easily turned back toward home and be done with it. However, my unnatural attraction to the mysterious was not so easily allayed. Surely there would be a signpost ahead. I stepped out of the sunlight and into the gloom of the covered bridge. My thudding footsteps clanged hollowly on the metal flooring, the echoes bouncing off the walls and ceiling of the structure until I felt suspended on waves of spiraling sound, waltzing through an aurora of spatial reverberations. However, as I approached the midpoint, all at once the noise curiously dissipated. Not completely gone, you understand, just muffled, as if pressure were slowly building inside my eardrums. Undaunted, I stepped directly into the center of the bridge. All was instantly silent. I could sense, but not hear, the outside world. It was though I had entered the eye of a hurricane. Fear, finally, took hold of me. I did not like this place anymore, and I no longer cared what might be waiting for me on the other side. As my pulse quickened, it was as though I could already see and hear in my mind's eye the image of my mother calling for me at sunset, worried, querulous, alone. The picture was so clear I was nearly convinced it was already too late in the day, and this troublesome scene was truly happening at this exact moment. Panic blossomed from the seed of unease. I grimly determined to turn around and return home. Yet, even as I willed my feet to correct course, I could not budge a centimeter. For, as I quickly realized, my shoes were no longer touching the ground. Slowly, my body began to rise into the still, warm air. Thrashing impotently, I attempted to dislodge myself from the invisible grasp of this strange force. Was it magnetic, otherworldly, a trick of my imagination? Even now, I am not entirely certain. I only know within seconds I was suspended, helpless, and moving ever higher. Concerned I might be pressed against the roof like some autumn leaf in a scrapbook, I cast my eyes heavenward. It was then I saw it. A cube of obsidian, about the size of my head, directly above me, sporting a single lustrous blue eye that peered down at me, unblinking. I could feel its cold, analytical scrutiny, not judging, but assessing me. My corporal form continued to drift closer to the cube, and as I rose, the strength was sapped from my limbs until I hung like a discarded rag doll. The two of us gaped at one another. Then, as God is my witness, the thing lowered itself by means of clinging, suckered tentacles, like a pendulous spider descending on its prey from viscous strands of black webbing. I had the distinct impression it had been waiting for someone, perhaps for an extremely long time, to pass beneath it unawares along this seldom traveled road. The thought came to me unbidden, and I realized it was not my own. While I recoiled at this notion, the azure eyeball opened wide, wider, as wide as it would go, and my head passed through the membrane, swallowed inexorably into the cube itself. Instinctively, I closed my eyes and held my breath. But instead of the expected feeling of hot suffocation and entrapment, there came a coldness on my cheek and a light source that tickled the corners of my eyelids. Tentatively, and with much trepidation, but still unable to quell my overriding need to seek out secrets, I gazed out at the unknown. All around was the vastness of space, though represented from a far distant vantage point, so that planetoids, which were ordinarily light years apart, appeared exceedingly close to one another. Stars, moons, comets, asteroids, meteors, and satellites waltzed through the darkness, sparking into being and then dying out, lifetimes snuffed in a fraction of a millisecond. Galaxies swirled side by side, the farthest reaches of their gaseous particles intertwining so that they became the very gears of the universe. A multitude of black holes and burning suns dotted the fabric of this luminescent tapestry like one of George Seurat's pointillism masterpieces. I could only watch in dumbfounded awe at the majesty and scale of these cosmic whirrings. Yet, beyond this glimpse of ever expanding vistas, I could feel an alien presence. It lurked, watchful and waiting, behind the veil of starlit draperies, a loathsome and infinitely evil consciousness whose attention I feared might stray toward me ere long. My natural born curiosity dwindled for the first time in my life, withering with fright. Again, I closed my eyes against this vision, willing myself to wake, to wake, to awaken. It's all a bad dream. Mother, can you call me down to breakfast, for I am yet fast asleep? This chanting mental reverie was broken by the sensation of an icy tendril piercing the middle of my forehead. I screamed then and lost all consciousness. When I finally regained my senses, I found myself on the opposite riverbank, feet firmly planted on the dusty road and the late afternoon sun blazing low on the horizon. I turned, fearful of seeing the strange cube thing floating near me, but nothing was there, not even the covered bridge. It had vanished without a trace, as if no one had ever even considered constructing a means to traverse the surging waters below. After a few minutes, standing unsteadily in the heat, I began the long trek to find an alternate way home. It was full dark when I stumbled up our driveway toward the farmhouse. "Lord, Jess," my mother cried when I finally came inside. "I was worried sick. Please don't stray so far from here." I promised her I would not, and I have kept that vow even now, 3 winters hence since her passing. In fact, I don't go anywhere. I stay inside whenever possible. Groceries and other necessities are delivered to my doorstep, where I retrieve them from my covered porch. Our maple trees have died out over the years, left untended and susceptible to disease. I never venture out at night. Too many stars. As I said, my predilection for mysteries was permanently extinguished during my encounter on that country road one fine Vermont summer day. Not due to fear or other malaise of the intellect. No, my questioning nature has been forever quelled because ever since I was shown celestial sights no earthbound human should see, I have all the answers. This newfound ability manifested a few days after returning from my final walkabout. Jess, have you seen my silver and jade necklace? The one your father bought for our anniversary. I had not seen it, I replied, even as I walked confidently to the sitting room, knelt down, and pulled it from where it had been dangling inside a floor heat vent where she dropped it accidentally 8 months ago. There is no way I could have known those details, except I did, somehow. And I knew other things without actually having learned or witnessed them. Correct responses to game show questions on television, every one of them, no matter the show, no matter the difficulty. Crosswords were a cinch. I could solve them in record time. They became boring. Lottery numbers, pegged perfectly during each draw. They weren't guesses, they were certainties. At first, I thought of using this superpower to fill our bank account, but I knew, sooner or later, someone would come poking around with inquiries. It seemed wiser to keep quiet, lay low, until I could probe the full extent of this knowledge. So I began to meditate, delve deep inside my own mind to see what might be hidden there. Turns out, everything. I could speak any language, predict elections, view the sweep and scope of worldwide pandemics. I knew the exact time of my mother's death and my own. Anyone's, in fact. I knew when the planet would be destroyed, vaporized into so much stardust after the Fourth World War. I could reveal to everyone whether or not there was a God. But I didn't. What would be the point? They would observe me as if I were some kind of freak. Maybe I am. Worse, nothing would change. The events of the future, oftentimes a blueprint from the past, rolled inexorably toward their horrible conclusion. So I spend my final days here at home, sequestered, incurious, staring into the sun, retinas burned beyond repair, beyond pain. I can still see, however, the brilliant blue eye that has opened in the center of my forehead perpetually peers, unblinking, not judging the rest of the world, but assessing it with a cold and analytical gaze. All right. That was A Country Road in Vermont. And the backstory on this is a long time ago, I discovered a document that H.P. Lovecraft had given to a young, aspiring writer. And in this document, there were 221 story seeds, little snippets, ideas that Lovecraft had jotted down as an impetus to write a story. And so I went on Discord this past week, or maybe this past weekend, and asked the first 6 people who would respond to give me a number from 1 to 221. And I took those 6 guesses and I rolled a d6 for funsies and chose a story seed that was essentially randomly selected by our one and only Atulia. And I took elements of Atulia's personal life, I guess, and just fused them here and there. Wasn't explicit with anything, but I thought it would be a nice little um, experiment, writing experiment. And I just, basically cranked this baby out over the weekend, did a little polish. It still needs some work, obviously. And I kind of just let it go where I thought it needed to go. It kind of led me. I didn't really steer it in a particular direction other than the story seed. And the story seed actually was something to the effect of uh, an unfamiliar road leads to a strange territory. It was very, like a very vague sort of thing. And of course, when I started thinking about Vermont, covered bridges, lonesome roads, that sort of thing. And I just sort of came up with this interesting little thing. I think originally what I was going to do was have it be a different imagination or different, um, sort of land or multiverse on the other end of the covered wagon, or covered bridge rather. But I kind of like the idea of just having this weird epiphany and someone who maybe is prone to dwelling on life's mysteries. What would cause them to not do that anymore? And I think in Lovecraft terms, when you have an investigator who is presented with the awesome expanse of horror and terror and unknowable stuff, that causes the quote unquote investigator, in this case the narrator, to kind of go crazy. And so we don't know whether or not the narrator in this story is actually privy to all of that information, or if maybe they just went wacko. We don't know. So yeah, so I hope you enjoyed that, Atulia. That was a fun experiment, and I want to do that again coming up. It's just really nice to be able to have a goal. Like I knew I needed to get this done by Wednesday in at least a halfway presentable form, and it was also kind of fun just to get back into the Lovecraftian style. Try to use turns of phrases that are a bit antiquated, and I think it worked out pretty well. So. All right, guys. Well, this is going to conclude this installment of Stygian Articles. Thank you for spending time with me. Appreciate it. If you've enjoyed this dark fiction, please visit stygianarticles.com for more of my scary stories and lovecrafttapes.com for fresh episodes of our Call of Cthulhu actual play podcast. I'm Jeremy, your keeper of arcane lore, wishing you sweet dreams. Good night. All right, guys, everybody in the chat, thank you for listening, watching along. Appreciate that. Hope you enjoyed it. I will be putting this in written form on the Patreon if you're curious. I'll let you read it there. All right. Thanks, guys. Have a good night.